Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It is my honor to introduce our speaker today, Richard Brookhiser. As you know, he is here to talk about his newest book called Right Place, Right Time, Right Place, Coming of Age with William F. Buckley, Jr. and the Conservative Movement. While I have to say I am personally in love with the title as it relates to his personal coming of age on the right, I also have to say that I take issue with the title in some small respect in that it implies that Richard somehow found himself in some very fortunate positions because of the kind of luck that right time, right place implies. Richard, if anything beyond a great author, is a talented historian, and he could probably tell you that I think it was Abraham Lincoln who once said, I believe, the harder I work, the luckier I get. Richard Brookhiser has worked very hard for a very long time to be one of the most prestigious and influential minds in the conservative movement in America. And one need only know a few facts about him to believe that. For example, when you are writing cover stories for a nationally recognized magazine, in this case the National Review, at the age of 14, you are working and, I think, thinking very hard. Currently a senior editor at National Review, he has worked there since 1977. He was the youngest senior editor there at age 23. He has also contributed to numerous other magazines, from the Atlantic Monthly to Cosmopolitan, and covered topics from the fall of the Berlin Wall to 9/11. He is a prolific writer, having authored 9 books, several of which are noted biographies on the personalities and noble ideas of our founding fathers. It is for this work that he recently received the coveted National Medal for the Humanities. I will let Richard cover the subject of his book in detail, but I can't help but quote from the very first lines from the introduction of his book. It has particular meaning to those of us here who are longtime supporters or even employees at the Reagan Library. In speaking of one of the central topics of his book, Richard says, quote, "William F. Buckley changed the world. I was at his side during the years the world noticed it. George Will once said, without Buckley, no National Review. Without National Review, no conservative takeover of the Republican Party. Without that, no Reagan. Without Reagan, no victory in the Cold War. I would personally add, without Reagan, no Reagan Library." That would certainly be a shame, because we would not be fortunate enough to hear from Richard today. But we are. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Richard Brookhiser.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm glad you got your priorities straight. That my being here is as important as victory in the Cold War. To be talking about Bill Buckley at the Ronald Reagan Library is like hero good luck, but that's fine. We'll do just fine with it. Let me begin at the beginning. Here we go. I met Bill Buckley by writing for him. I grew up in Irondequoit, New York, a suburb of Rochester, a mid-sized upstate city, with my parents and my older brother, Bob. In the fall of 1969, I was a freshman in the local public high school. I didn't know anybody who went to private ones. My brother was a junior at Yale. Every weekend of the school year since he had gone away to college, I wrote him on a small black metal typewriter that had belonged to Mom a letter rehearsing the events of the week: basketball games, school plays, little triumphs, tiny disasters, bulletins of adolescence dramatized and ironized. One week, the news barged into this home theater. Opponents of the Vietnam War had called for a nationwide moratorium, or day of protests, on October 15th. The moratorium looked to be a big thing on college campuses, where teach-ins and boycotts of classes were scheduled. Some kids in my high school decided to join in. I thought they were wrong. I also thought there was something phony about the exercise, simultaneously preening and copycat. The moratorium supporters at Irondequoit High presented themselves as dissidents, but they were tagging along with a national movement, mimicking their elders. I decided to put counter posters, anti-protest protests on the school walls. I imagined myself as a latter-day Martin Luther, taping rather than hammering up criticisms of orthodoxy for all to see. I generated my posters by typing them out over and over on a black typewriter, using carbon paper to produce 4 copies at a time. I had only 12 contentious theses, not Luther's 95. After a night's work, I made my posters and gave them to the world on the 15th. All my efforts and the more organized protests of Moratorium Day that I hoped to deflate went into that weekend's letter to my brother. It made for a longer story than usual, and in his next letter home he said he had enjoyed it. Then my father said, "Why don't you send it to National Review?" No one in my family knew anything about journalism. We knew William F. Buckley Jr. from television, and we'd been subscribing to his magazine for half a year. Perhaps that would be entree enough. I took Dear Bob off the beginning of my letter, added a conclusion, and sent it away. Months passed without a word from National Review. I assumed they had not liked the submission and thrown it away, and that this was standard procedure in journalism. Then, after the new year, I got a letter from C.H. Simons, Assistant Managing Editor. Dear Mr. Brookhiser, please forgive our slowness in dealing with your manuscript. It somehow got buried on my desk. This, I would learn, actually was standard procedure. Miss Buckley, Priscilla Buckley, Bill's older sister and managing editor, Mr. Buckley and I have read it and are eager to publish it. Anyone who submits something for the approval of the world expects in some corner of his mind that he will be approved. But when approval actually came, it was startling. The world of public events, which included the media that reported on them, was out there. Now someone from out there had signaled back. More surprises followed. When my article appeared in the issue dated February 24, 1970, one day after my 15th birthday, it was the cover story. Moratorium Day at Irondequoit High, said the headline, by Rick Brookhiser, student. The next surprise, a few weeks later, was a check for $180. The question of money had given me some anxiety. It must cost something, I thought, to print magazines and distribute them. Perhaps I would be asked to contribute to help defray expenses. The idea that I might be paid in addition to being published was icing on the cake. About the time the check arrived, I began getting letters from readers. There were 20 in all, which would be a piddling response in the days of email and texting. But in 1969, when each of these communications had to be sealed, stamped, and dropped in a mailbox, it seemed impressive, all the more to someone who had never gotten a letter from anyone he did not know. I know why the assistant managing editor, Miss Buckley, and Mr. Buckley published it. I was a dog walking on its hind legs. 15-year-old speaks. I was also dog bites man. There were plenty of young people, even in the late 60s, who were conservative or simply not liberal. But they were not the young people you saw on television or in most newspapers or magazines. The archetypal young people of the major media, whether admired or feared, were idealistic liberals, hairy radicals, or copulating druggies, heroes, rebels, or freaks. Here, said the editors of National Review, was a kid, a high school freshman no less, who speaks for the unseen. There was one more reaction to the piece, the most important of all. A blue 3x5 card with National Review's name and address in bold and an italicized identifier, William F. Buckley, Jr., editor. Below that, in spindly red ink, a message, something like, Richard, nice going, congratulations, or Rick, very nice, thanks. In time, I would learn that every contributor to every issue of National Review got such a card from William F. Buckley, Jr., which did not diminish its value, rather the reverse. The cards were a courtesy in a profession that often skipped courtesies. Over the years, I saved many such cards, a fraction of all the ones I was sent. Since they were undated, I can't tell now which one came first. No matter, they were a beam of attention from the top. And then I go on in the chapter just to explain how Bill and I both reached this point, and I end it this way. At 44, Bill's age, when he accepted my article, he was conscious of the passage of time. In the early 60s, William Rickenbacker, a younger colleague, sat in on one of his interviews. Bill was in fine form, like a jet with a switchblade. The reporter saved his roughest question for walking out the door. Bill smartly knocked it aside. When the door closed, he turned to Rickenbacker and grinned, I can keep this shit up till I'm 40. He kept it up much longer, but even an enfant terrible senses when he is no longer literally an enfant. Out of the blue, here came a kid pulling the same stunts he pulled in college, only he was doing it in high school. Bill may have thought, even then, maybe I found another me. So that's how I begin Right Time, Right Place. And the book has 3 arcs, and each of those 3 arcs is in that opening section. And one of the arcs is biography. It's a biography of the last 40 years of Bill Buckley's life. Now, we need biography to connect us with great men, to inform us about great men, where it's appropriate or possible, how to imitate great men. And we need it because great men die, and because memories die. I'm very struck as I was writing this book and then publicizing it, when I would talk to people in their 20s, very often waiters or waitresses at restaurants that I go to all the time, and you know, what are you doing? That would come up, and I'd say, well, I'm writing a book on William F. Buckley, Jr. And they wouldn't know who he was. I'd have to explain who he was. And this is something you wouldn't have to do 15 years ago, certainly not 30 years ago. Even an apolitical person, even someone who didn't follow the news, would have known who Bill Buckley was. Robin Williams had a Bill Buckley imitation. You know, as a comic, Bill Buckley was one of the people that he would just, one of the voices he would assume. And that was a testament to Bill's ubiquity and to his importance as a public figure. But his TV show, Firing Line, went off the air in 1999. He died in 2008. And in this media culture, the form of the media culture we live in, that means you've passed away. So I want to recover that career and that life and make it vivid again for people. And 2 of the things, I mean, there are many things, but 2 of the things I want to recover, one is his humor, which I think was unmistakable while he was around, while he was a public figure, but was rare to the degree he had it then, and is still rare. I also want to recover what a fighter he was. And this is something, he mellowed as he aged. And so even if we retain memories of him, they are affected by how he changed over the course of the end of his life. And he did mellow, but he was not mellow when he started off, and he was not mellow when I first encountered him, first on television and then by writing for him and by knowing him. Bill was a killer. Bill could be a killer. If he was debating you, he would cut you a new one. He could do it, and he did do it many times, and with famous people who were not used to having that operation performed. And one of my favorite anecdotes, which captures both the humor and the aggression, it involved Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the eminent historian of Andrew Jackson and FDR, and a lifelong, very devout, dedicated liberal. And at some point, they got involved in a quarrel. And Schlesinger wrote Bill a letter, and he made a passing reference to National Review or the National Enquirer, or whatever you call your magazine. Well, that was the wrong thing to say, because Bill wrote back, now Arthur, how would you like it if I began a letter, Dear Arthur, or Dear Barfer, or whatever you call it? And, you know, if you ever want to spank a Pulitzer Prize winner, that's how to do it. I mean, you're saying you're behaving like a 5-year-old. By the way, if you really want to do it, this is how to do it even better. So it was both the lightheartedness of it and the willingness to really get in there and hit back. And in this case, to hit back when he felt he was being disrespected, and therefore when his ideas were being disrespected. The second arc of the book, which was touched on even in the part I read to you, is history. I came into his life in 1969, 1970, and he died in 2008. So that's almost 4 decades of history. It goes from the Vietnam War to the surge in Iraq. And an awful lot happened in those years. And one of the lessons, certainly for conservatives, that I hope conservatives would take from that, has to do with the gloom that conservatives feel at the end of the George W. Bush years, and then the victory of Barack Obama. And there's just a lot of gnashing of teeth out there. And people are getting their hopes up a little bit as healthcare gets into trouble. But there's still a sense of feeling beleaguered. But if you read about the 70s, you'll realize that they were much worse. The 70s were horrible. They were a horrible decade. It begins with Nixon's fall from grace, from his resigning lest he be impeached and convicted. It had the fall of Saigon and all of Indochina. One of my very first assignments at National Review was to write about one of the first reports that came out of Cambodia, what was going on in Cambodia. There was a French Jesuit named Father Francois Panchaud, who lived and worked in Cambodia, and he wrote a report that said the communists, the Khmer Rouge, are killing hundreds of thousands of people. I think he said 700,000. That was on the low side. But it was just this hecatomb, this world historical catastrophe. Gerald Ford was a very decent man, but not an effective president. Jimmy Carter was not effective. I won't say whether he was decent or not. The Soviet Union and their surrogates were doing whatever they wanted. The Portuguese Empire in Africa was being run by Cuban troops. Now think about that. It's like reverse colonialism. It sounds absolutely bizarre how that worked, but it was true. The Portuguese colonial empire was being taken over and run by Cuban troops. Grenada and Nicaragua got communist or very left-wing governments. Afghanistan was invaded. There was stagflation. There were oil shocks. It was a horrible decade. And yet it ended with Ronald Reagan. Now, I'm not saying all bad times end with Ronald Reagan. I mean, sometimes they just keep getting worse and worse. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they can turn around. And the way you make them turn around is that you know what is right, you know what you stand for, you keep doing the right thing, and then, you know, with some luck and some will, then maybe the bad times will turn around. But I want that out there as a message for conservatives today when they're feeling doomy and gloomy. Maybe you don't have to be quite so gloomy as you feel. And then the third arc of the book is memoir. And it's not the full memoir of my life, but it's the memoir of my life with Bill Buckley, who was a father figure for me. My own father is, he's 91, he's going to be 92 in November, and he had his own interesting life history, but he was not a man of words. He didn't read much. He didn't write. He certainly never discouraged me. If anything, he encouraged me to write. And he was always very pleased and proud of my successes, but we just weren't on the same wavelength. So to send some writing off into the world, and then to have this older and famous and very cool man, who was a great writer himself, say, this is good, you know, and you're good, and I want to publish your stuff. I mean, that was very thrilling, and that was very important, and it really sent my life in the direction that it later took. Now, you know, as I said in the book, Bill also felt he found another him. He had many active years ahead, but he's already thinking, I believe, in 1969, well, what comes next? Who carries it on? And he thought, well, maybe, you know, maybe this guy. And he was so youthful himself all his life that he was always looking for young writers and young talent. So we had a kind of love at first sight, and as is often the case with love at first sight, there were problems. There were problems later. And the relationship took some twists and turns, which I describe in the book. And it took some work, it took some working out to reestablish it on a better footing. But that also had to be done to make it real. But Robert Frost wrote in one of his poems that we love the things we love for what they are. But in order to do that, we have to know what they are. We have to know what they really are. And so this book is partly a story of two people, me and Bill, just trying to figure out who the other one really was, and then seeing what sort of a relationship we could have on the basis of that. And I'll just tell you, I'll just end with the ending of the book, which is the story of the one time I got to tell him to his face and in public what he meant to me. And I'll give you the complete version, which I couldn't, I had to modify a bit in the book, and the reason was it involves a poem by William Butler Yeats. And my editor said, you know, if you're going to quote as much of this poem as you're intending to quote, you're going to have to get a permission from Yeats's publishers. And I'd done that once before, and I didn't want to jump through those hoops again. You know, and they also charge money and so on. So I paraphrased a bit, but I'll give you the full thing. And this was at a party that Henry Kissinger threw for Bill after he stepped down as editor of National Review. And Kissinger said, you can draw up the guest list. You know, invite whoever you want. It will be at my apartment right on the East River. Like, got this drop-dead view of the East River. So Bill did a very Bill-like thing. He said, well, let's invite all my younger colleagues. You know, he wasn't going to invite his old Yale chums. He wanted to invite his younger colleagues. And I was like the third oldest person in the room. Chris Buckley was older, Bob Tyrrell was older, but it was all, you know, people my age and down. And Bill, the other Bill-like thing he did is he made Henry Kissinger perform. You know, after this dinner, and Kissinger is the host, he's throwing the dinner, right? And Bill raps on his glass and says, well, you know, will Secretary Kissinger favor us with his view of the universe and how it's working? And so Kissinger gave us this tour d'horizon. And then we were all sort of hearing after that. And one of my friends said to me, Rick, you ought to give a toast. And I'd actually been thinking of, you know, I knew what sort of an occasion it would be, and I had something in mind. And my toast was based on one of Yeats's last poems. It's a poem called Beautiful Lofty Things. And it's just a poem about people who were important to him. He's writing this as an old man, and many of these people are dead at the time. Some of them, the rest are as old as he is. And it's a variety of people. One of them is a drunk. And Yeats says, stand to show Grady, supporting himself between the tables and speaking to a drunken audience high nonsensical words. Another one is a former lover. And he says, Maud Gunn at Houth Station, waiting a train. Pallas Athena and that straight back and arrogant head. And another one is Yeats's own father. And he's remembering a moment in a controversy over the performance of a play in Dublin. There's a play, The Playboy of the Western World, which is set in rural Ireland. And the Irish nationalists thought this was disrespectful of the peasantry. So they protested the play. And on the opening night, there was such disorder in the audience, you couldn't hear any of the lines. And they did this again at the second night. And Yeats's father, who was an artist, a painter, and he was outraged by this. He thought this was, he was an Irish nationalist himself, but he thought this was primitive, barbaric behavior. So he spoke at one of these, a later performance, and Yeats remembers it. And he says, my father on the Abbey stage, before him a raging crowd. This land of saints, and as the applause dies out, of plaster saints, his beautiful mischievous head thrown back. And I said to Bill, it's not my place to describe your head, but I have never known anyone more respectful of real saints or more disrespectful of plaster ones. And that has been beautiful. So that's my taste of the book, and I'll take any of your questions.
We've got a few minutes for some questions.
Who was Mr. Buckley's mentor, and did he have certain individuals that he looked up to?
Well, I think one of them was Wilmore Kendall, who was a professor of his when he was a student at Yale. And he also worked at National Review in the early days, and this was long before I came to the magazine. And they had quarreled, and Kendall had left, and he may even have been dead by the time he died early. He died of a heart attack. But Wilmore Kendall was a political philosopher of some consequence. He wrote an important book about John Locke. He also wrote about Rousseau. But he also wrote about contemporary politics. And people who know them both say that both Kendall's writing and his speaking style, his actual accent, were very influential on Bill. Kendall had a peculiar accent. It was sort of an Oklahoma drawl, plus he'd been to Oxford, so it was this odd mixture. And Bill had a similar thing. I mean, people would say, well, Bill talks like an Englishman, but it wasn't really. His parents were Southerners. His mother was from New Orleans. His father was from Texas. But he had gotten some private schooling as a boy in England. So, you know, you put that together, and that was sort of the Buckley. If you listen to it carefully, there's sort of a drawl underneath it with some sort of British overlay. Certainly the two who were kind of closer to my own experience, Whittaker Chambers. And, you know, this is just evident from Bill's writing. Bill quotes Whittaker Chambers a lot. He was deeply impressed with this man as both a hero for, you know, for revealing to the world, as he did, his past as a communist spy master, and for saying that, well, one of my spies was Elder Hiss, and going through the endless seeming process that took to get Hiss finally convicted of perjury. And Chambers was also a great writer. There was a kind of a tone of sorrow that he could have that Bill was very impressed and moved by, and he was often quoting him. The mentor that I knew, I met him at the end of his National Review career, was James Burnham. And James Burnham was, well, let's see, he was 20 years older than Bill, and he was 50 years older than I was. So he was in his 70s when I first met him. And he had been a follower of Trotsky in his youth. He wrote a book which influenced George Orwell, The World of 1984, and this world of these three contending empires which are post-capitalist, and also they pretend to be socialist, but they're not really socialist. They're just totalitarian empires that fight endlessly for control of the world. And Orwell got that from Burnham. I mean, he was kind of appalled by Burnham, but he was also very interested in his mind. And so Burnham became conservative in the late 40s, early 50s, and he was a man who, you know, you could just tell that if we were having an editorial conference and if people were going off in some gust of feeling or something, and if Burnham would say, well, but it's really this way, I mean, Bill would listen to that. You know, and that would really be that. I mean, Bill heated this man. So those are, you know, those are three influences, and you can, you know, and you can see how they affected his style in various ways. Though, like any great stylist, Bill's style was unique. Yes.
What would be his view of, say, some of the current TV and radio so-called conservative talk show hosts? Describe themselves as such. Well, how would we view them, let's say, towards the latter part of his life? Not so much.
Well, you know, Bill was a great writer, but he was also a great television personality, and he, you know, his gifts happened to intersect with television, as television was when he was on it, in a way that was a terrific fit. And, you know, it's not like he calculated on doing this. It's not like he took a course on how to become a TV host. It was, that Firing Line was in a way his after-dinner conversation. That's what he'd do after dinner. He'd rap on his glass, and he'd make people speak, and then there'd be discussion. Now, obviously, Firing Line was more adversarial and a little more heated. But so, I mean, he was bringing elements of things from his sort of pre-television life into television. After dinner discussion, also college debating. I mean, he was a very active college debater. So I guess, you know, if you watch Firing Line from the 1960s, you're also seeing how people debated in the late 40s in college at Yale. But, you know, that's how great media personalities do that. They bring other elements to what they're doing, which gives it an extra twist. I mean, you know, Rush Limbaugh is good on radio, partly because he employs old pre-radio rhetoric. I mean, there's this kind of Carney Barker and courthouse oratory tone that he has, and that's not all it is, but he injects that in there. That's what makes it different. The media world always changes. I mean, television changed, and it moved past Firing Line. I have a discussion of John McLaughlin worked for us at one time, and he was our Washington correspondent. And the McLaughlin Group changed TV talk, just changed it. And I say how that happened, and it kind of left Firing Line behind. But you know, every person who comes on has to, you know, has to deal with the media world as it is and see how he can fit into that. I was, you know, it occurred to me the other day, would Bill tweet? Well, you know, if he were still with us, and if he were, you know, 87 years old, I don't know if he'd be tweeting as an 87-year-old, but if he were back as a 25, 26-year-old, you bet he'd tweet. I mean, this is a man, he wrote 3 columns a week. I'd say 1 in 5 had some sort of personal anecdote. He had a column in the magazine called Notes and Asides, which was all based on letters to him. He wrote 2 books, each one about a week in his life. You know, and this is not from vanity, or not only vanity, it's knowing how to use the materials of your life to draw points from them. And that's what good tweeting is. I mean, a lot of it's boring junk, obviously. But most things that are written are boring junk. I mean, the question is, how do you make it good and better? And so, yes, I think Bill, you know, tweeting is a very personal medium, and I think, you know, he if you were reborn, I mean, he'd find a way to do that. So, and you know, you do your thing. You don't worry too much about who else is out there. That's the way you drive yourself nuts. I mean, you just do your thing. So I think that's kind of a roundabout way of saying he wouldn't be telling you too much what he thinks about other people. He'd just be doing the best job he could do for himself. Yes, sir.
I want to say that I've followed Bill Buckley since I was in college. I guess he was not too far ahead of me. But, and I've admired him and think the world of him like most of us do. However, after reading your book, and after reading Chris Buckley's book, it does seem that he had some serious flaws. And I was kind of disappointed. And I guess all great men have serious flaws. But I'd like to have your comments on that.
Well,
and I wouldn't say what those flaws are. I'll take away from those ones, right?
Right, and then Chris's book is his own story. I mean, I was Bill's surrogate son, in a way. Chris was the actual son. And that's a whole different thing, a whole different assignment. You know, and Chris wrote the book he felt he had to write. But look, I've written about George Washington, about Alexander Hamilton, about John Adams and his descendants, about Gouverneur Morris, and you know, really putting Washington aside as an almost unique person. And he too has his limitations, but these are all men with a lot of bark. I remember when I started researching the Adams family, I was reading about John Quincy Adams, and I thought, how am I going to write about this man? He is detestable. He is absolutely detestable. And the way I wrote about him is, yes, he was detestable, but he was other things too. He was brave, he was smart, he was honest, except when he was defending himself. He was dedicated. He could, and sometimes he had to use that detestability
You know, you don't fight the slave power in Congress for 15 years the way he did by being a nice guy. I mean, you're facing the hatred of the slave-owning congressman, and you just have to give it right back. So he was able to use both his good qualities and his bad qualities to, you know, to have the effect he had. So look, unless you're writing the Gospels, you know, you're not going to be writing about unflawed figures, and that's just something that every biographer knows. But most biographies are about people who net are more positive than negative. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't write them. I mean, there are Hitler biographies and Stalin biographies, but most biographies, I would say, are about admirable people, net admirable people, and that's certainly my my conclusion after writing this book and after, you know, going through all the thinking of writing this book. There were things about Bill that I realized only in the course of writing this book. Also things about me I realized only in the course of writing this book. And I'm flawed also. I mean, you'll see from the, I'm not telling you all my flaws. But you know, you'll see some of my flaws and limitations in here. It just comes with biography. It comes with humanity. Yes, sir.
National Review is a magazine of high national importance. Would you ever consider to develop a forum where we could have open discussions relating to our present-day problems, like healthcare system?
Well, we used to do, when John O'Sullivan was the editor, we used to do a lot of conferences, which was a new thing for us. And as with most things that magazines do, we did them because the editor liked them and wanted to do them. That's the way it works. And John loved these conferences. And some of them were very good. I think the first one was probably the most important because it was 1993. It was right after Bill Clinton was elected. Conservatives were also in the dumps. And Newt Gingrich came to our conference. I describe it a little bit in the book. It was in Washington. And Gingrich said later, I remember what he looked like. He didn't put on a tie. He just came in a shirt with like a pullover sweater. He looked like he just rolled out of bed. And he seemed, you know, Newt is a very ebullient man, but he seemed a little down. But he said that conference really helped him get recharged. Now, I think Newt would have got himself recharged anyway, but the conference helped. So to that extent, I think it was important. We stopped doing them because Rich Lowry is now the editor, and he likes to do different things, you know. And do I think that's a fatal loss? No, I don't. You shouldn't do anything that you're not wholehearted about. And so since Rich wouldn't be wholehearted about such things, better not to try it at all. So I guess my answer is no.
We have time for 2 more questions.
As a media, don't you consider it your responsibility to lead the people in the right direction? I mean, correct or falsely?
Sure, of course. That's you know, we put the magazine out every other week. That's what we try to do. We've been doing it since 1955.
Thank you.
Yes, since you were so close to him for such a long time, can you comment on his relationship with his wife and his place in New York society?
Well, that's an interesting story, and I only got, you know, I did come to know Pat. Pat could be a lot of fun. I remember I invited them up to country house my wife and I have in the eastern Catskills, and they came up in their limo. I don't know how many limos come up to Crohanson, New York, but they drove up, and they were late. They'd taken a wrong turn, and Pat brought the spaniels, you know, and she like says out the window as they come down the driveway, "Are we still in the United States?" I expected no less from her. And we grilled salmon for them, and my wife and I said, well, the maple syrup on the salmon, we tapped our own trees. You know, made this. And she said, why, you live like the Amish. Pat was richer than Bill. She was from a very wealthy family. And I think Sam Tannenhouse may go into some of this in his biography, which he's been working on for a long time. But I remember having a lunch with Sam some years ago, and he was saying that you know, Pat helped give Bill entree into certain circles that even he might not have automatically had. And he did tell me, right after she died, he was reminiscing about going out to British Columbia to ask her father for her hand. And he said, you know, Mr. Taylor he was a formidable man. He was a director of the Bank of Canada. But Bill also said he wondered if he wasn't a little edgy because Bill was an American and because Bill was an Ivy Leaguer. So, you know, as we all know from Edith Wharton novels or Jane Austen novels, these things are very complicated. So on the one hand, there was even more money on the Taylor side. But, you know, Bill is from a less provincial place, and he's from an Ivy League school, and so, you know, there were a lot of cross currents going on. And, you know, if I had known them better and longer, I mean, it could have been an interesting novel. I got a glimpse of a little bit of it.
One last question.
Yes, ma'am.
I attended school during the late 70s, and I was a humanities major. I was an English history minor. Now, what's interesting is that my daughter is attending school right now. She's at Cal State Northridge. And the difference between, I guess what I'm getting at is the parallels between this administration and even in the late 70s. When I was in school, I took classes that were, I guess, you know, philosophy and those things that could have been really contentious with your instructor because they were all liberal. And my son says to this day, how did you stand humanities? And I said, because back then there was respect back and forth between. I didn't flunk a class because I didn't write the right thing. Now that's happening all over now. We have, my daughter's 21 and her friends, I mean, basically my daughter said to me, she was taking this, I don't know, this one course, and it was philosophy in America, and which sounds so leftist to me, I almost freaked out. And she said, what does that mean? She was going, Mom, all I can say is that the first 5 minutes you'd have gone for her throat. And I said, okay. So what I'm saying is, what parallels do you see between the administration now? I don't see the animus back then in the 70s. There was really mutual respect on both sides. Now, it seems that we have to muffle ourselves a little bit more than we had to. And I don't know if it's Barack Obama's style or, you know, I have no, but it seems different to me 30 years later. What we're into right now is completely different than what I experienced even in the 90s than I have right now.
Well, I mean, look, I also remember the late 60s. You know, I think the mid-late 70s were objectively worse in certain ways, but in terms of rancor, I mean, certainly what Lyndon Johnson got and what Nixon got was just, you know, was as bad as what we're in now. When I give talks about the Founding Fathers, I do say that if, and it often comes up as a question, I don't have to introduce it. People say, what would they think of our politics now? And I say, they would think, gee, you made it better. You know, it's less crazy, it's less contentious, there's less lying, there's more efforts to be objective. I mean, if you really want to read barking mad stuff, go back to the 1790s and really right up through the War of 1812. And part of that, and these are great men doing this, but, you know, Thomas Jefferson honestly thinks, he certainly says repeatedly, that his enemies are Anglo men and monocrats. In other words, they're pro-British monarchists. And Hamilton, who's, you know, he's sort of better tempered, but he does write one letter and he says, well, the stakes at this election are, you know, freedom, property, blah, blah, blah. And he says, and of course heads, meaning that the Jeffersonians will set up guillotines. Now, he's tossing it off as kind of a joke, but he also half believes this. You know, and also, remember, Hamilton was killed by the vice president. When Cheney shot that guy, it was an accident. And he lived. And one other signer of the Constitution was killed in a duel, and one signer of the Declaration was killed in a duel. And Thomas Jefferson put a man named Brockholst Livingston on the Supreme Court who had killed a man in a political duel. And it never came up in the confirmation hearing. You know, this is what people did. And dueling was illegal everywhere. Deaths and duels were murders under the law, but they were never prosecuted because no jury would convict. So are we that bad?
Yeah, so barely.
Not quite. I mean, we're getting back there. But you also mentioned your son, right, in college?
My daughter.
Or your daughter. Okay, well, yeah, that is, I mean, that's just bad, and that's getting worse. I know a number of American historians, and we're really losing to retirement a great generation of them. And even though they are, they may be like liberals in contemporary politics, they really take, say, the American founding seriously, and they try to write seriously about that. And one of them is Joseph Ellis. He's one of the younger ones. But the last time I saw him, Joe said to me, when I retire at Mount Holyoke, I'm not going to be replaced by another scholar of the American Revolution. I will be replaced by someone who will teach about looms. Just looms and the common people who ran the looms and so on. And I'm not saying we shouldn't know about that. Of course we should know about that. But to only know about that, or to know about that in the way I imagine it will be taught, I mean, we're in for worse. But my response to that, whenever it comes up, is we just have to do our thing and make it better. That's all. The only way you make anything better is by doing it better yourself. That is the only way. And sitting around complaining about it does no good at all. You just have to get out there, do better television, be funnier, be smarter, write history, whatever it is, find what it is, go do it, and do it as well as you can, and hopefully better. And that's the only way things change. Okay, thank you very much.
It is now 2 o'clock. I am sure that if you have been as informed and entertained and as educated as I have by Richard's remarks, you will want to head upstairs to our store where you can say hi to him personally. He'd be happy to sign a book for you, and you can purchase a book, which I really encourage you to do because it is terrific. So thank you so much for coming today, and we'll see you upstairs.